Okay. So we won't really spend any class time in particular on chapter 4 unless you have some questions, and I'll canvass the class about that before getting into chapter 5 on Wednesday when we see each other again. So when a week from today, we'll start on the major moral theories that are still quite dominate in the moral theoretical landscape. And so we'll begin with consequentialist theories, which include egoism, utilitarianism, and we'll spend quite a bit more time actually on utilitarianism than we will on egoism. And yeah, we'll also talk about social contract theory, the social contract tradition, to some extent too. So that will be a week from today, next Wednesday. And then looking even farther ahead into week 4, we'll continue that very brief survey of the dominant moral theories in the contemporary world with non-consequentialism. So we'll start with consequentialism, primarily utilitarianism, and then we'll look at non-consequentialist theories as largely represented by Kantian deontology, so the important 18th century German philosopher Immanuel Kant. But in that context, we'll also talk a little bit about, depending upon whether we have time, we'll talk about natural law theory. And then after that, so the next moral theory that we'll talk about is Aristotelian virtue theory. And then getting into week 5, the first session for that week will wrap up our introduction to moral theories with the feminist ethics of care and feminist ethics more broadly, because it's not reducible really to care ethics. Many feminists, as we'll see, reject care ethics, but that's perhaps the most influential or popular subset of feminist ethics in current standing. And then the second day, so Wednesday of that week, week 5, will be a session for us to wrap up any loose ends, a kind of overview of what we've gone over so far, also a review session for questions that you have for the midterm exam, which is due that week. And so for all of week 5, the midterm exam will be open for you to take. But once you do open the exam, you'll have 2 hours in which to complete it. But it'll be open from midnight on Monday, week 5, to Sunday at midnight at the end of that week. So you are then free, of course, to take the exam prior to a review session on that Wednesday, but I would, of course, recommend against it. I mean, there's no real reason to. You could benefit quite a bit from the review session and that discussion. So, okay. So today we're going to finish up with relativism, emotivism, and then we'll talk about moral reasoning, during which we'll really focus substantially on argument and argumentation. And I introduced you a little bit to that towards the end of our session earlier this week. So are there any questions about anything in connection to what's coming ahead in the weeks to come, or any of the material that we've discussed so far? Any questions or comments? Okay, cool. So before we jump back into the discussion of relativism, I want to give you guys an opportunity, and I'll typically do this in our second weekly Zoom session. So on Wednesday, I want to give you guys the opportunity to get into some small groups via the breakout room to talk about the discussion forum for this week. So many of you I've seen have already contributed to that forum, so you might use this as an opportunity to flesh out the view that you've already articulated, entertain perhaps potentially conflicting views of your peers, or if you haven't yet contributed to this week's forum, well, this is kind of a preparatory step in that direction. So you can kind of bounce some ideas off of your peers and us when we bring it back to a whole class discussion. And then you can draw on that when you are responding to the discussion forum for this week. So does that sound good? Any questions or issues before I start putting you into the breakout rooms? So before I do that, so we're on the same page, let me just very quickly share the screen so that we can see what the available prompts are for this week's discussion forum. And when I set you into these breakout rooms in small groups, you don't have to discuss all 3 of the prompts. You can just focus on 1 or 2, or you might want to discuss all 3. It just depends on the dynamic of your group. So let me share the screen just so we're clear on what the questions are. So 2 of the questions have to do with chapter 2, and then the 3rd question has to do with the current chapter for this week, so chapter 3. So question 1 has to do with cultural relativism. Question 2 is connected to emotivism. And then question 3 has to do with moral argumentation or reasoning. So the first question, according to a cultural relativist, would the civil rights reforms that Martin Luther King Jr. sought be morally right or wrong? And this is, of course, particularly apropos given that Monday is our celebration of Martin Luther King Jr. Day. Do you think that his efforts at reform were morally wrong? What are your reasons for your decision? Okay. Question 2, suppose a deer that had been shot by a hunter writhed in agony for days before dying. You exclaim, how she must have suffered. Her horrendous pain was a bad thing. In this situation, does the word bad refer to any moral properties? Is there really something bad about the deer's suffering? Or is your use of the word bad just a way to express your horror without making any moral statement at all? Explain your answers. And then, so that is again in reference to the moral theory of emotivism. And then 3, think of a moral question. So this is the question related to chapter 3, moral reasoning. Think of a moral question you are not sure how to answer, such as an action that you're not sure is the right one to take. So a kind of moral dilemma or quandary. How might you use the process of giving and responding to arguments as a way to refine and clarify your views on this topic? So you might have something particular in mind, some moral question that has confronted you recently or perhaps plagued you for quite a while. So I'll stop sharing, but are there any questions? Is there any for further clarity on those prompts before I put you into the groups? No? All right, cool. So I'm going to construct these breakout rooms. So got 23 in here. Let's see. So I'll make 6 breakout rooms, which will have 3 to 4 participants per room. So I'll go ahead and put you in them now. And then I'll let you know. I'll give you about a minute or so to start wrapping up your conversations, and then I'll end the rooms and we can all talk about these things together. All right, so I'll send you that way now. Students are in breakout rooms right now. I was actually just about to send them a message to wrap it up. So it might be best if you just kind of hang out here.
Okay, sounds good. Sorry.
No worries. So I'm gonna actually head to the restroom just real quick, and then I'm gonna do that. So you can just hang out.
What are they discussing in the breakout rooms?
Oh, so right now they're talking about one or all of the prompts for this week's discussion forum. So two of those prompts have to do with chapter 2, and then one of them is connected to chapter 3.
Okay, thank you.
We'll talk about that briefly together once everyone comes back.
All right.
All right, so I'll start closing the rooms now. All right, let's give everybody just a minute or so to come back to us. Still waiting on just a couple. Okay, here we all are. So I expect there's some pretty good points made or arguments advanced in your little group. So does anybody want to volunteer to share something with us to get started?
For the third question, my group was like talking about execution is like death penalty in America, and like the moral philosophy behind that, whether it's right or wrong to carry that out.
Okay, good. And so the question is, how might process of building arguments or engaging in moral reasoning help figure out a way to go forward in a question like that? Did you guys discuss anything you think is helpful there?
We kind of just like we're talking about how you can't really like play God in that situation where like you can decide whether or not somebody lives or dies, and like in some cases the people are innocent and like they live their whole lives on death row, and also people who like commit atrocious crimes, they all want to like kill themselves. Like they state that they want to die. So if you just give them what they want instead of like letting them be in jail for the rest of their lives, it's kind of just giving in to them. Does that make sense?
Yeah, so it sounds like you guys came up with a number of potentially competing reasons.
Yeah.
It seems to conclude against the moral viability of capital punishment. But just stepping back a bit from the specific content of those reasons, like what's going on just abstractly in terms of what I'm calling and what we're addressing here as ethics, which involves moral reasoning, advancing clear arguments, entertaining counterexamples, achieving clarity about significant relevant concepts, and so forth. So maybe can someone else kind of jump in and speak to that based on the good starting point that B gave us? Because it seems, I mean, some reasons were given, and of course, moral reasoning, to put it just very simply, is the process of giving, exchanging, entertaining, considering reasons, right? That's all reasoning is. Giving, exchanging, considering reasons in support or in justification of a particular conclusion or claim. And so at this point, we just kind of spit out a number of reasons, but is there a way to think through what's going on in such reason giving more systematically?
Make sure the reasons aren't fallacies.
Good, good. And so what's a fallacy exactly? How you're using it?
I guess it's something, I don't know if this is right, but I guess it's something with like flawed reasoning.
Good, yeah. So I mean, a different way to put flawed reasoning would just be fallacious reasoning, right? So a fallacy is a line of argumentation or reasoning which is flawed in such a way that is rather common enough to be afforded a particular name, right? So that's one way to understand what a fallacy is. And as we'll see today, there are within the ambit of moral reasoning or logic, actually more broadly than that, logic would include and motivate and inform moral reasoning. There are actually two kinds of fallacies. So formal and informal fallacies. And I suspect what Ronnie has in mind is more in alignment with the latter, so informal fallacies. And we'll talk about that difference, but informal fallacies, especially when it comes to questions and problems in morality or ethics, are far more common, and they're also far more dangerous than the formal fallacies. But you might find formal fallacies in different contexts of moral and political deliberation. But the informal variety is much more dangerous. And one thing I think is important to note that's not really mentioned in the textbook is although we consider both kinds of fallacy under the rubric of logic, as I just said, I think it's more accurate to say that the informal fallacies, which are the ones that we'll be more focused on, are actually problems in rhetoric, much more than they are problems in straightforward abstract logic. And so if we identify them as problems or errors in rhetoric, then that can bring to the fore much more coherently, much more pressingly, the moral character of such reasoning. Because when you, for example, just a common informal fallacy would be something like the ad hominem, which from the Latin means against the person. So that's when you attack a person's character or you disparage something about an individual and you use that to support a conclusion about a particular argument. So that's not necessarily illogical so much as it is, I think, quite obviously immoral, right? So you're using a rhetorical technique in order to bypass dialogical ethics, basically. And what do I mean by dialogical ethics? There are moral characteristics to how to carry on a straightforwardly fruitful, mutually productive, and respectful dialogue or conversation. And if you are literally through your language or whatever else abusing the persona or character of the person with whom you're in dialogue, well, that's clearly immoral, even if it's not obviously illogical. And so, of course, because you might say, well, how is that illogical if my whole point here is to win the argument? Well, that's why it's difficult, but important and necessary to tease apart logic in the abstract sense, which makes it very much akin to mathematics, to tease that apart in some sense from rhetoric. And so it'll be more clear perhaps what I mean by that once we get into the difference between formal and informal fallacies. But good, so Ronnie was saying, like, we want to be careful not to engage in fallacious reasoning. In order to, specifically, she said, in order to ensure, because you could supply a number of reasons that are supposed to justify a particular conclusion, but the question is which reasons are better. And so the negative quality of fallaciousness is a negative criterion or standard against which we can, in a shared space of reason giving, distinguish good arguments from bad ones. Right. And so it's helpful to be aware of what these fallacies are and the kind of appearances they can take in different contexts in order to be aware of that. Okay, and so that's important for moral discussions, but obviously discussions of a political nature too. So I'm sure after working through chapter 3 and looking at a number of the informal fallacies, you might have connected them to ongoing moments in our contemporary political discourse, right? So that political discourse is increasingly fraught, I think. The landscape of that discourse is increasingly fraught with rhetorical, that is, informal fallacies. if not, in some cases, even formal, so more obviously logical fallacies. So good. Are there any other things you might say about that third prompt? Did anyone come up with another example of a moral?
We were talking about physician-assisted suicide.
Oh, okay.
And discussing the aspects of that, the moral stuff.
Yeah, so what examples or ideas did you come up with connected to that?
Well, anyone else in my group can chime in, but I was thinking, you know, what you define as suffering and whether you want to eliminate suffering or not.
Okay, good. So how might that come up in the context of someone actually making an argument?
It would talk, I don't know, their moral stance, you know, whether they're utilitarian or you know, someone else.
Good. So as a utilitarian, your whole aim in making these advancements in moral reasoning would be to come upon conclusions that spell out a way to reduce suffering or to maximize happiness or pleasure or whatever else. So from a utilitarian moral theoretical standpoint, you might try to come to that conclusion, but in that reasoning, you would also have to, and this is an important conceptual point, you would have to do some work in the direction of defining concepts, right? So one thing in connection to physician-assisted suicide would be defining the role, conceptually speaking, of healthcare providers, right? So as we'll see when we get to that moral issue, that's a big piece of the debate, right? So exactly what are healthcare providers supposed to do? Well, if someone says they're supposed to, among other things, to the extent that they are able, minimize or reduce suffering, well, you might have to flesh that out a little bit more, because someone who is against physician-assisted suicide might say, well, a physician who assists someone in dying, isn't that actually increasing suffering? If we understand, you know, death to be an instance or perhaps an egregious instance of suffering. And so if we understand, maybe to put that in a different way conceptually, if we understand, because that's a bit loaded to talk about suffering, it's loaded, that is, on the side of utilitarianism from the beginning. But if you say more neutrally that the role of a healthcare provider is to, yeah, I was just about to say that, Noah, is to do no harm. Well, then you find one horn of the dilemma expressed pretty straightforwardly, given this definition, that to kill someone or to aid in their demise, if that's not harming, then I don't know what is, right? So that seems to be conceptually at odds with the role of the healthcare worker. But then someone could propose a counter argument coming from the very same starting point and say, well, we're talking about those who are terminally ill and in the experience of that terminal illness are suffering a great deal, in light of which death would actually be a merciful reprieve. So in that way of framing it, the healthcare provider who does assist specific people, so those who are suffering from a terminal illness come to a peaceful end, are really alleviating suffering. But it's important, before you can even have a significant discussion or debate about this issue, to gain clarity on those conceptual matters. So good, does that make sense? Okay, so what about the other two questions? Did anyone have anything to say about those? So in connection to chapter 2.
For the first one about MLK, in that time, in that era, it was against the societal norms to like fight for civil rights, so it would be morally wrong in that time period. But you know, as time went on, it became more societally acceptable to fight for civil rights, and that became more the social norm, even though there are still problems today, but it became a more widespread idea for equal rights. So it would be morally right today, but back then it would be wrong.
So that's according to cultural relativism specifically,
Yeah.
right? But so what are some thoughts on that? Is that correct? Because saying the opposite would be to contradict the truth of cultural relativism as a meta-ethical starting point, right? So
well, there's an argument about how ethics, your ethical views or beliefs can trump laws. And if you don't believe that those laws are ethical, then you can violate them by practicing civil disobedience.
Yeah, so then in many cases, as is demonstrated by the history of civil rights movements, illegal actions are actually necessary for immoral expressions or actions or efforts at change, right? So illegality and so maybe even criminality, so acting against or transgressing an existing legal norm is sometimes required morally, right? So it's very important to keep in mind that, especially when we talk about certain moral theories, like in the context of Immanuel Kant's theory, where the idea of the moral law is very important, we have to be clear that when we talk about law in the moral context, we don't mean human law, right? So Kant would argue that the moral law, which is ultimately an expression and articulation of intersubjective, so universally shared reason, that is the source for any human-made law that would be moral, right? So if there is a human law which stands against the test of intersubjective universal reason, according to Kant, well, then that law is immoral, despite the fact that it exists as a law within a given society. And so, yeah, that would be a view contrary to the position of cultural relativism, because it seems, for the most part, that a cultural relativist would have to take an opposite position on that question and think that existing legal structures not only mirror or represent moral structures, but are actually productive of them because they express the will of a given culture, right? But then that opens up certain questions that we can pursue. And this is one question or problem with cultural relativism that we haven't exactly talked about yet. And it is the excessive sort of simplification of matters that cultural relativism enforces or takes for granted. So for the cultural relativist, the dominant moral perspective of an existing culture is the determination and the source of what is right or wrong for that culture specifically. But then we can ask, well, what culture? What does that mean? So thinking of Martin Luther King Jr., for example, and civil disobedience, the civil rights movement of the 1960s, or even let's go before that. So when slavery was legally instituted in this country. So according to the cultural relativists, we might say, well, slavery was right. It was morally right because that's what the dominant cultural perspective embraced. But how dominant, we might ask, does that perspective have to be? Because if you were to ask African Americans living in American society at the time whether or not they think slavery should be a thing, pretty sure they would say no. Or thinking of like Nazi Germany, for example. As a cultural relativist, you might say, well, 1930s Germany, the cultural view was that Jews were a problem and should be exterminated or eliminated. Well, that might be different if you asked German Jews, right? They were members of the society and culture too. And that's even more of a problem as we advance in history, such that we're becoming less and less homogeneous as we develop into an increasingly global society, right? So we all belong to a culture or a society that is deeply multi-layered, right? So I'm not just an American, I'm an American male of a particular class who lives in a particular geographical location of the country. I might be involved in all sorts of subcultures, so different groups. So I'm, of course, a part of the university institution and so forth. So looking at all of these levels or layers of our cultural participation or membership, we can often find contradictions or opposing recommendations at each of these levels when it comes to what's morally right or wrong. And so then cultural relativism as a theory isn't very helpful in sorting out which perspective it is that we're supposed to be turning to as the source of moral truth in a given society, given how messy and multifaceted society in general can be, right? And so just checking the chat real quick. Yeah, B mentioned gay marriage wasn't legalized until 2015, but LGBT rights still were dominantly viewed as morally right before the law said it was. True. And again, depending upon the subculture of which you are a part, you might find a different conclusion on that matter. So it's not very clear which view you should be turning to for guidance when you're looking for the moral right. So that's a good point. Okay, any other thoughts? Any other important points or questions your groups might have come up with? Okay, so I don't want to spend too much more time on chapter 2, but I'll just pull up a couple slides and talk over or talk through them with you guys in case there are any questions. And then we can move on to chapter 3. So let me pull up the presentation from Monday. So we'll start with this slide here. And so just so we're clear also, by the way, Stace as a 20th century moral philosopher was not actually a proponent of relativism. So it could be confusing, but in these slides and in the textbook, when we talk about Stace's argument for cultural relativism, that's not an argument that he actually embraces himself, but because there are no real philosophers who have tried to, in explicit terms, advance arguments for cultural relativism, what Stace has done is he's reconstructed such an argument in order to critique it, right, in order to criticize it. And so that's what we're doing here. And so some implications of that argument, namely that starting from the premise of differing moral judgments, we transition to the conclusion of differing moral principles, right? And so there are certain problematic implications of that. First of all, cultures are morally infallible. And so I just want to spend some time with these implications. And if there are any questions or points of unclarity, we can address them before moving on. So who can explain why, if cultural relativism is correct, then it follows that cultures are morally infallible? So why is that an implication?
Because each culture says they're right.
Good. And remember, importantly, the fact of a culture saying it's right is actually sufficient as a source or a foundation for the moral truth, right? In other words, just like in divine command theory, the fact that, well, according to theists of a particular tradition, the fact that God said, you cannot lie, is sufficient in itself to make lying immoral. So in this case, the fact that a particular culture seems to think that some phenomenon or behavior is wrong or right, that's sufficient to make that phenomenon or behavior wrong or right. Does that make sense? Good. So that means just the fact, and whether it's clearly articulated in writing or verbally, that a given culture subscribes to a particular moral state of affairs, it could just be implied in the concrete practices of that society. But that is in itself the only thing which makes the moral truth. That is to say, there is no sense of moral truth from this perspective outside of the expressions of it within existing societal frameworks or behaviors. Okay, so the next implication, cultural values cannot be criticized from outside the culture. So can anyone speak to that implication or explain that? So why is that the case? Anybody? So as given as an example in the textbook, certain African cultures traditionally practice female genital mutilation or circumcision. And from our point of view as Westerners, we might find that repugnant or deeply morally problematic. But why can we not criticize those cultures, even if we feel that way, if cultural relativism is right?
What they're doing is neither right nor wrong.
Or rather, the rightness or wrongness is dictated directly by the expression or the practice, right? So, I mean, you were kind of talking more appropriately about emotivism there, which is a non-cognitivist position according to which there is no moral truth in an objective sense. That's not entirely true for cultural relativism. It's rather more contradictory, actually, than we find in emotivism. So from cultural relativism, from that point of view, it's simultaneously, at the very same time, both right and wrong, the practice of female genital circumcision, right, or mutilation, however you want to describe that. It's both right and wrong. And even within our culture, historically speaking, slavery is both right and wrong, depending upon the point of view you take, right? And so philosophers have indicated that this is a major source of why cultural relativism is insupportable, precisely because it seems to manifest in these contradictions, these logical contradictions. If something is bad, it can't at the very same time be good, right? Okay, so the next issue is social reformers within a culture are by definition morally wrong. So that's really what we were talking about in connection to the Martin Luther King Jr. example. A social reformer who wants to turn back social injustices or inequities or to repair them would not actually, from the point of view of cultural relativism, be repairing them. They would, by definition, from within the dominant cultural milieu, be wrong. Precisely because what is right, as we've said already, is dictated by that dominant cultural milieu. So the mere fact that we had segregation and the legacy of slavery and Jim Crow and so forth would be seen as sufficient to manifest the rightness of those practices and institutions, which means that anyone who wants to change or reform them is by definition wrong, right? But of course, we think that that's not true, that cultural reformers are making reforms, or at least trying to, for the good. But if cultural relativism is right, then that piece, for the good, doesn't really mean anything, right? Because good just means what every society is already doing. So there's no room to change it. And that's why we get to the last problem, that if cultural relativism is true, moral progress is virtually impossible. So looking back on the reforms of civil rights activists and leaders, we would say that they didn't advance or contribute to any moral progress at all. It's just that they changed things We can't say that they changed things for the better. We can't say that we're now in a better place having abandoned practices and institutions like slavery. We can't say that it's better. All we can say is that it's different, right? But one flaw with that is it seems to belie our basic moral intuitions. And so that's an important thing. We tend to think that we have improved across time and that we can actually improve more. So we want to change our society for the better. But if we adopt cultural relativism, it's not clear how we can do that. Because again, when we try to change existing social norms as they're enacted in our society, we would by definition be wrong. And even if those changes were to take hold, we couldn't describe them as an improvement. There would just be a change, a historical change that is more or less value neutral. Okay, so yeah, I don't want to take too much more time, but is that pretty clear? The major flaws with cultural relativism? Okay, any remaining lingering doubts or questions about that? So one final thing to say is the only reason it seems, and it's a sensible reason, it makes sense, it's laudable, that people seem to gravitate towards cultural relativism is this appeal to tolerance, right? We want to respect other cultures, so we don't want to take some position of moral self-righteousness and say that we're better than them and so forth. But that's a problem, because what if you have a culture that is deeply intolerant? Well, what does that mean from the point of view of cultural relativism? Well, that means that that culture is right, and it's right precisely to be intolerant. So cultural relativism, even if we like it because it seems to endorse or enable tolerance, it actually undercuts or undermines tolerance, because we would have to tolerate intolerant cultures. And I'll just put it this way: to tolerate, excuse me, to not tolerate intolerance shouldn't be understood as an act of intolerance. Because if you tolerate intolerance, well, what do you get in the end? A bunch of intolerance. So if you really want tolerance, well, then sometimes you're going to have to fight against intolerance, which means even if it's taking a strong foothold in your society or in another society, you shouldn't endorse it. You shouldn't accept it. But that doesn't mean you have to be an asshole about it. I mean, you can still be respectful. You can still try to come to terms with why an existing society embraces certain norms that you take to be intolerable, and so forth. And you can try to achieve mutual understanding by the very things that we're going to talk about next. So by taking moral reasoning seriously, as not just a logical endeavor, but an ethical endeavor in itself, right? So that's what I was talking about earlier in the sense of ethic or dialogical ethics, the ethics of how to dialogue with others who might be different than you. And if cultural relativism is correct, there's no reason to dialogue at all, right? Because then I just say, oh, well, I disagree with your culture because that's not my culture, but that's it. You have your culture, I have mine. There's no space for discussion, right? So the problem is cultural relativism emphasizes too much differences rather than potential points of unity. And cultural relativism also closes the door on any meaningful conversation or dialogue through which we can achieve moral progress. And in fact, as we've seen, cultural relativism, by definition, denies the reality of moral progress in the first place. Okay. All right, so if there are no questions, we'll transition now to chapter 3, but why don't we take just a few minutes of a break beforehand? Yeah, let's just take a few minutes of a break. So I have 2:31. If we could be back here by like 2:34 or something like that, that would be great. So I'm going to run to the restroom and I'll see you guys in just a few minutes. All right. Sorry, I got caught in the hallway conversation with a colleague. I don't get to see too many colleagues anymore. It's like a ghost town around here. All right, so I will share the screen and we'll talk about chapter 3. So I would recommend, for those who haven't done this already, I would recommend practicing some of the exercises in chapter 3, working through some examples of informal fallacies and so forth. There are exercises in deconstructing arguments and diagramming arguments. You can do that if you want. I don't find that particularly helpful. So as a philosopher and also as someone who just cares about ethics and argumentation, I have never actually done that. I've never found it helpful or useful to diagram arguments, but you could be different. I don't know. So it might be beneficial for you, but we're not going to really talk about that aspect of chapter 3. Okay, so I'm going to share the screen. For the slideshow now for chapter 3. So this chapter is centered around the process and concept of argumentation and argument. So argumentation being the process through which arguments are constructed and evaluated. So just first off, and this is an example from chapter 3, is this an argument? So let's get some shared understanding, some clarity as to what constitutes an argument. So here is a few sentences put together. The number of abortions performed in this state is increasing. More and more women say that they favor greater access to abortion. This is an outrage. Is this an argument?
I mean, it's making an argument, but it's not a very well-backed one.
Is it even making an argument? I mean, I kind of saw your head, someone's head shaking. I don't have names right now on the squares, and I haven't learned all of your names, unfortunately, yet. But any other? So someone was about to say something, sorry.
I was just gonna say that there's no logical conclusion to the argument.
Yeah, there doesn't seem to be. I mean, you could, I think like Poppy was suggesting, you might tease out through a kind of charitable interpretation of these sentences that someone is maybe struggling towards eventually making an argument. And you can find ways that that might happen, right, based on what we're given here. But as it stands, this isn't an argument. And why not? So what is it missing? So I think you just kind of mentioned the important piece that's missing. So what is that again?
Just a logical conclusion.
Yeah, so I mean, what is the conclusion? So it might be this is an out. Oh, go ahead.
It was their emotional response to their views on abortion instead of like saying like something like a statistic or something, or saying I don't like this,
right?
Not like furthering it.
Exactly. It's this is an outrage might be translated to I don't like this. And that's not exactly a moral, or rather a conclusion for a moral argument, right? Because someone might reply, okay, you don't like it, great. And there are all sorts of things I don't like. But you could alter this and make it into an argument fairly easily. You could say something like, well, I don't need to. I don't need to tell you how to do that. I think it's pretty clear. And in any case, it'll become clearer once we work through some of the material from this chapter. But so this is what makes it not an argument is it's a series of sentences, but missing is as was suggested, a clear logical conclusion that could be, I think, pretty easily clarified and supplied, but there doesn't seem to be any clear moral statement. So there are non-moral statements. For example, these are statements about fact, right? So the number of abortions performed in this state is increasing. Okay, maybe that's a true fact that you could figure out. More and more women say that they favor greater access to abortion. Perhaps that's a true fact too, that you could figure out through some research. But neither of those say anything about morality, right? So if you were to supply a moral statement somewhere in here, it would be something like, abortion is morally wrong, right? So that's a moral statement beyond the articulation of non-moral facts. And so the addition of something like that might help this towards becoming an argument, but whether or not it's a persuasive or a logically sound argument would be a different question, right? So we'll move on there. But so this whole chapter in the textbook is about moral reasoning, but moral reasoning isn't anything particularly arcane or fancy. It's just reasoning, ordinary, straightforward reasoning that is applied to moral questions or problems, right? So it's reasoning, but in the context of moral questioning and deliberation, rather than some other area of life. And this means that it's similar. The mechanisms and structures through which this kind of reasoning is pursued and organized is comparable in the abstract sense to how reasoning is deployed in any other area of life, right? So this is just to point out that when we're engaged in moral reasoning, we're not doing anything particularly mysterious or something with which you're not already familiar, right? Because as human beings, whether we're conscious of it or not, or whether we use this kind of vocabulary about it, we're all engaged at different moments of our lives. I would say every day, even, in reasoning of one form or another. So this is something that we're already doing. But when we're dealing with ethics, we're often reasoning with others, because if you existed as the only individual in the world, perhaps there would be no ethics, right? So ethics seems to presuppose a shared space or a community, which involves others, other perspectives, other experiences, other views, and so forth. And so just for the rest of this course and the ways in which we're going to be taking up moral reasoning in different contexts, it's important to keep in mind this approach to dialogue, right? What does it mean? Well, it derives from the Greek dialogos. Dia is a prefix indicating across or through, and then logos is a very rich and complicated word in Greek philosophy. It can mean word, it can mean sentence, it can mean argument, it can mean definition, it can mean explanation, all sorts of things. But it involves speech, it involves language, right? So what are the elements that make this up, this speaking through or speaking across? Well, first of all, we should be listening, right? And when we listen, one way to put that is we open up a space of difference. And that just means a space in which some other perspective or view can be encountered. That is a space to meet the face and voice of the other, which is in any case different from your own. And then when we speak, we go across. So using the dia aspect of dialogue here, we move across that space of difference that has been opened up. And of course, since you are moving in that space towards or in some respect of connection with the other, that involves a kind of risk, right? You're making yourself vulnerable for rebuttal, right? The other might take what you've given as you cross that space of difference and reject it, or illogically transform it, or something else, right? So you're opening yourself up to risk, which means ethical dialogue can be, in many cases, potentially scary or disturbing or uncomfortable, at least. And then dialogue itself isn't just the combination of listening and speaking, because I'm sure we're all aware of situations in which there is, to some extent, listening and speaking happening, but you might not call it dialogue. So dialogue involves actively caring enough to hold open that space of difference, such that the truth might emerge, and it might emerge in such a way that you're actually surprised that you have changed your mind, quite literally. You have come to a different conclusion than you expected. And so that's a potential outcome of dialogue understood in this way. Okay. So some other important terminology, a statement. And so statements, we're dealing with moral arguments and moral statements. And so we're going to get some clarity on the difference between moral arguments and moral statements. So these are examples of statements. So these are, as linguists tell you, grammarians, these are declarative sentences. So that's another way to understand a statement. Or in other words, a claim. So it's an assertion that something is either true or false. So murder is wrong. 1 + 1 = 2. Shakespeare wrote The Tempest. These are statements, that is, propositions or declarative sentences, and they are such precisely because they have truth valence or truth status, and that just means they can be either true or false. But if I change these into, for example, an interrogative sentence, a question, is murder wrong? Well, that's not a statement because it has no truth valence. There's no truth status to a question. There can be a truth status to an answer to a question, but not a question, right? So that's why in much of ethical dialogue, we try to avoid relying on rhetorical questions, right? So in many cases, we want to flesh out explicitly what we mean by these rhetorical questions, such that we are dealing with statements that can be meaningfully integrated into a logical argument of some kind. And so we'll see how that's the case. So now, what is the relationship between statements and arguments? Well, when at least one statement provides reasons for believing or accepting another statement, then we have an argument. So a pretty straightforward way to define argument. And so here we're dealing with logical argument, not with the kind of thing you get into, say, with your significant other over what to eat for dinner or something like that. A logical argument is a series of sentences or statements, one of which is a conclusion, and at least one of which is a premise. So that's a nice way to define an argument. A collection or a series of statements in which one is the conclusion and at least one is the premise. So more frequently, arguments have several premises, but to be an argument, you have to have at least one premise. And so we'll talk about what a premise is versus a conclusion right now. So the statement that is the major claim that you are putting forward in an argument that you want others to accept is the conclusion, and then the supporting statements. And again, for an argument to be an argument, there has to at least be one. The supporting statements are the premises. So an argument being a series of sentences, one of which is the conclusion or claim, and at least one is a premise or a piece of justification or support, it's intended to prove something, right? So to advance some purported truth as the conclusion and to convince others that it is in fact the truth, that it is in fact the right conclusion to accept. So like we saw at the very beginning, the first slide, a cluster of unsupported claims is not an argument. Even if those claims might have the superficial appearance of being supported, or at least supporting each other. So how can you be sure that you're dealing with an argument? Well, since an argument always has one conclusion, that is a major claim that the arguer wants you to accept, it's very helpful to try to find the conclusion first. So to try to figure out what it is that the arguer is so convinced of themselves and wants you to be convinced of too. So you look for certain conclusion indicators, such as therefore, consequently, hence, it follows that, thus, so, it must be that, it must be the case, or it is the case that, or ergo is a more pretentious indicator word for conclusions. And then once you figure out what the conclusion is, you can see whether or not there are actually premises given to support that conclusion. And so here are common indicator words for premises: because, since, for, or for that reason, or for the reason that, given that, due to the fact that, assuming that, indicated by, and so forth. So it can sometimes, given an especially complicated piece of writing, it can be very difficult to figure out what is operating as a premise and where even the conclusion is. So it can be helpful in sorting through a kind of overwhelming body of words to find these indicator words. Right? So, I mean, there are more than two forms of argument. There are a few, but for our purposes, for simplicity's sake, we're going to be dealing with deductive argument and inductive argument. So we already saw some examples last time on Monday of inductive arguments, and we'll turn back to those in some other instances as well. But we'll also talk about inductive arguments. So what characterizes deduction is this concept or category or standard of judgment called validity. And so I mentioned that briefly last time, and we'll dig into it more carefully now. But in contrast, what characterizes an inductive argument is not validity, which is a technical term that we'll unpack, but rather probability. And so a deductive argument is supposed to give logically conclusive support to its conclusion in a pretty black and white way, right? So an argument is either valid or it's invalid. There's no real gray area. But when it comes to an inductive argument, a conclusion can be more probable or less probable by degrees, right? So there's quite a bit of gray area. And one thing to note too is by definition, any inductive argument is invalid. That is, by the standards of deduction. But that doesn't mean that every inductive argument is bad. It just means that we're using a different standard of evaluation. But it is true, nevertheless, that inductive arguments are always weaker than deductive ones, precisely because of the probabilistic nature. And so again, feel free to interrupt me if you have questions or if you need clarity on something, or if you want to make a comment. So when it comes to deduction, we can talk about common and less common argument forms. And this is because of a feature that distinguishes deduction from induction. That is, when it comes to deduction, we're mostly focused on the abstract structure or form of the argumentation rather than the determinate content that's being argued about. And this is why when we're dealing with deductive arguments, we can use the language of propositional logic, as it's also called, or natural deduction, which is a different language as a symbolic language, ultimately, and a formal symbolic language. It's different from, say, the English language. And when we're doing this, we would translate English language arguments with a specific content into the abstract formal language of deduction. And so we'll look at a few examples of that. And so we can talk about universally valid forms, which means that regardless of what it is that you're arguing about, so regardless of the content, if you put that content into one of these valid forms, no matter what it is that you're addressing, it's going to be a valid conclusion. And the same thing goes on the other side. If you plug in anything you want, any kind of content into forms that are invalid, it doesn't really matter what you're talking about, you're going to get an invalid conclusion. And so it's often helpful from the point of view of the discipline of logic to translate arguments into this formal language, because then you can more clearly see where those arguments might have gone awry. But when it comes to induction, we are dealing with content more so than any sort of formal structure. And so that's why you can't translate into a symbolic language the content of inductive proofs. So we'll talk about that in a moment. So this is an example of a valid argument that I offered last time. So all men are mortal. That's premise one. Socrates is a man, therefore Socrates is mortal. So this is a classic example of a valid argument, and what makes it valid is precisely that given the premises, it's impossible to have a false conclusion. So a valid argument is such that if the premises are true, the conclusion has to be true also. If you have a case in which the premises are true, but somehow you get a false conclusion, that's a great indicator that you've found an invalid argument. But that's not the only way in which an argument can be rendered invalid. So there's good old Socrates again. And so I gave this example last time. All men are mortal, Socrates is a man, therefore Socrates is mortal and he's ugly. Although in this case, every one of the three sentences is true, it's nevertheless invalid. And that's because given the truth of the first two sentences, it's possible that the conclusion could be false. It's not necessarily the case, but it's possible, and that's enough to render it invalid. And it's possible that the conclusion is false, given these premises, because part of the conclusion has nothing to do with the premises, right? So that's another way to see where an argument has become invalid. So this is another example I used, and this is a case in which all of the sentences are potentially false versus the last argument in which all the sentences seem to be true. In this case, you might say the first sentence, well, that's empirically quite obviously false. The second sentence, well, that's arguable, depending upon who you ask, but I think most would say it's false. And then of course, we know that eating a moon rock wouldn't be particularly satisfying for most people. So sentence 3 is false, but it's still a valid argument. This is still a valid argument, even though it seems to be completely insane. It's still a valid argument, and that's only because, remember, when we're dealing with validity, we're concerned with the formal structure, and the formal structure specifically with respect to the relationship between the conclusion and the premises. All right, so now we talked about a few valid forms. So modus ponens, modus tollens, and the hypothetical syllogism. So here are some examples, and also I show you how the formal symbolic language works, how that translation would go. So notice this argument. If it's raining, then the ground is wet. It is raining, therefore the ground is wet. And so you would translate this in the following way. So this is an arrow, and that indicates a conditional operator. So these symbols that bring together statements are considered logical operators. And so in this case, the arrow is a conditional, or in other words, it's an if-then statement. So you read it like this. What is before the arrow is the antecedent. And so this is why this is called affirming this argument form is also, instead of modus ponens, it's also referred to as affirming the antecedent. And that's because in premise 2, you're affirming, you're saying it's correct, whatever is in the place of the antecedent. So the antecedent is what comes before the then. So it's what attaches to the if. So if it is raining, then the ground is wet. I'm affirming the antecedent. It is raining, thus I can conclude the consequent. So the consequent is what comes after the arrow. In this case, it's the ground is wet. So P just means it is raining, and Q just means the ground is wet. So this reads, if it's raining, then the ground is wet. It's raining, therefore the ground is wet, in line 3. And often in this notation, the conclusion and the premises will be separated by a horizontal line. So often there would be a line right here separating these. So does that make sense? Any questions on this? Okay. So this is another example of a valid form, and this is known as modus tollens, or denying the consequent is another way to put it. And that's an always valid form. So if it's raining, then the ground is wet. The ground is not wet. Therefore, it's not raining. And so this is how you would represent that in the symbolic notation. So if P, then Q, not Q, therefore not P. Right? So because this is a valid logical form, deductive logical form, again, it doesn't matter what you're talking about. Anything that you plug into this hypothetical, and then in the case of premise 2, where you have a denial of the consequent of that hypothetical or conditional, then your conclusion in this form will be valid, right? No matter what it is that you're talking about. And so lastly, here's an example of a hypothetical syllogism. So if I read too much news before bed, then I'll have restless sleep. If I have restless sleep, then I'll be in a bad mood tomorrow. Therefore, if I read too much news before bed, then I'll be in a bad mood tomorrow. So this is how you would represent this hypothetical syllogism. So it's called hypothetical because it deals with if-then statements, and it's called a syllogism. And this comes from the ancient Greek philosopher Aristotle, so over 2,000 years ago. It's called a syllogism because it's an argument form that's made up of 3 sentences. So 2 sentences and a conclusion. So it reads like this in the symbolic translation: if P, then Q; if Q, then R; therefore, if P, then R. And so often in the textbook, by the way, the author mentions arguments that have hidden premises or implicit premises. And so that's commonly found in hypothetical syllogisms. And Aristotle called this an enthymeme. An enthymeme is an argument that has at least one unstated premise or one hidden premise. But it's not a bad thing always that you keep certain premises unstated, because they're more often than not common sense or pretty obvious, right? So in this case, and if this were an enthymeme, I might get rid of the second premise. And I might just say, if I read too much news before bed, then I'll be in a bad mood tomorrow. and you might fill that in and think, oh yeah, because if you read too much bad news before bed, you won't sleep very well, or something like that. Okay. But now, formal fallacies. So we talked briefly about fallacies already today. And so I mentioned that there are formal versus informal fallacies. So a formal fallacy is really the reverse of a valid argument form. It's a form that is always invalid, regardless of the content. So notice this example that is rather suspiciously or misleadingly, I should say, similar to the former. So if it's raining, then the ground is wet. It's not raining, therefore the ground isn't wet. And this is a fallacy known as denying the antecedent, because in the second premise, that's what we're doing. We're denying the antecedent to the hypothetical or the if-then statement. But why is this invalid? So what makes this an invalid conclusion?
The ground could have been made wet some other way, like somebody watering their lawn.
Exactly, right. So just because the first two premises are true, it's not sufficient to prove or substantiate the truth of the third sentence or statement. Because like you pointed out, Connor, there could be any number of reasons why the ground is wet, independently of whether it's raining, right? Okay. So here's another example. This one's affirming the consequent. So if it's raining, then the ground is wet. The ground is wet, therefore it's raining. So this is also invalid for a similar reason, right? Again, there could be a different reason other than the rain for the ground being wet, right? So it's not sufficient given these two premises alone to make this conclusion. Okay, so any questions about those examples? They're pretty clear. Okay. So a deductive argument is valid if the premises support the conclusion. And what that means is that the conclusion follows necessarily by the premises, the assumed truth of the premises. So the premises guarantee the truth of the conclusion. Contrarily, a deductive argument is invalid if the premises don't support the conclusion. And that just means that in some instances where premises are true, the conclusion may or may not be true. But in valid argument forms, valid deductive argument forms, that's not possible because the truth of the premises necessitates, guarantees the truth of the conclusion. So here's some other terminology. So we talked about validity, but like with the moon being made of green cheese example, that was a valid argument, but using this technical terminology, it's unsound. So it's valid because given those premises that the moon is made of cheese and all cheese is delicious, it would necessarily follow that the moon would have to be delicious. But it's unsound still, even if it's valid, because we reject the truth of the premises. Because we would say, well, the moon is not made of cheese, and not all cheese is delicious. Some cheese is positively repulsive, right? So if I reject the truth of those premises, then regardless of whether or not the structure itself is valid, I have no real reason to support or to accept the conclusion, right? Because we want the structure, that is the inferential relationship between premises as justification or support, to be meaningfully connected in the proper logical way to the conclusion. But even if that holds, that minimal criterion, even if it holds, we also want the premises to be true, right? And so and we saw a bit of this Monday. So when you want to, for whatever reason, criticize an argument, a deductive argument, you have two strategies available to do so. You can either show that the structure is invalid, which means that given the premises, the conclusion does not necessarily follow, or you can show, and this is actually much more common, especially when you're dealing with formal or academic philosophy, because philosophers tend not to give too many invalid arguments. I mean, it does happen sometimes, but usually if you want to criticize an argument, it's because you think that one of the premises is false, or at least problematic. And so that's the more common strategy to take, but it's very difficult And it's actually beyond the parameters of logic to pursue that tactic, because you have to engage in empirical inquiry, right? You have to go out in the world and try to determine whether or not certain statements that serve as premises, whether they're true, right? And so how you do that, well, it's how we figure out what's true under any ordinary circumstance, with careful questioning, with critical distance, trying to maintain some measure of objectivity, trying to avoid bias, all sorts of ways, right? Okay. But now let's turn to inductive argument. So remember, an inductive argument, as opposed to deductive proofs, rely on the principle of probability rather than validity. And for that reason, as I mentioned, every inductive argument, no matter how strong or weak, is by definition invalid. That is, by the definitional criterion of deduction. So here's a very common example of an inductive argument. The sun came up 1,000,000 years ago, it came up 1,000 years ago, 100 years ago, 10 years ago, 1 year ago, yesterday, today. Therefore, I conclude that the sun will come up tomorrow. So why is this, by definition, an invalid argument? What makes this invalid if we were judging it in accordance with deduction?
The premises don't support the conclusion?
Well, they do in some way, right? Because it's not unreasonable for me to think that if something has occurred so many times in the past that it will continue to occur under similar circumstances in the future, I mean, that seems pretty reasonable. So there is some kind of support. But what specifically is lacking in terms of the kind of support we see here when it comes to deduction specifically?
Maybe a moral premise?
Well, no, so this isn't a moral argument. You have to have a moral premise. But remember, how do we distinguish a valid conclusion from an invalid one? So what was that definitional point?
That the premises are true?
No, so that's a criterion of soundness, right? So a sound argument is both valid and it has true premises. But specifically when it comes to validity, what does that entail or require? So there is support, but fleshing out what support means here. The conclusion follows necessarily from the premises. So given the premises, there can be no other possible conclusion. So looking at this conclusion, is it necessitated? Is it guaranteed by these premises?
Just because it's been happening for so long doesn't mean that it's like guaranteed that's going to happen the next day, the day after that. Because
exactly. Yeah, perfect. So to put that in another way, in the premises, we have information concerning the past, right? But in the conclusion, we have information concerning the future. So just like in the one bad version of the Socrates argument, all men are mortal, Socrates is a man, therefore Socrates is mortal and he's ugly. There's nothing in the premises about his appearance, ugly or not, making it invalid. So in this case, there's nothing in the conclusion about the past, right? It's all about the future. And more importantly, I should say, there's nothing in the premises about the future, right? So that's kind of smuggled into the conclusion at the end. And as it was pointed out, it could very well be the case that the sun won't come up tomorrow, right? So we all know, or hopefully we know, that the sun is not eternal. It's going to burn out at some point, right? Regardless of what it's done in the past. But in any case, just because this is invalid by the lights of natural deduction, we wouldn't reject it as a bad argument, right? This is a perfectly sensible argument. And that's because given the preponderance of evidence that we see in the premises, it is more probable than not that the conclusion is true. So it's more probable than not that given what we know from the premises, that the sun will come up tomorrow. So unlike deduction, when we're dealing with induction, if the conclusion given the premises is greater than 50% statistically in terms of probability, you would say it's a more or less good or more or less strong argument. So it's evaluated by degrees rather than the black and white determination of validity. So in this case, an inductive argument is strong if it gives probable support to its conclusion. So if its premises are true, its conclusion is also likely to be true. It's weak if it does not give probable support to its conclusion. So in such an argument, given the premises, the conclusion is not actually rendered more probable than not. So even if you are given these premises, you still wouldn't be persuaded of the conclusion. But someone can lie through their teeth to you through expressing different premises and putting together an inductive argument. And so through those lies, you might think that the conclusion is probable. So just like when we're dealing with deduction, secondly, we also want those premises to be true, right? So we could lie all day and come up with ways to convincingly seem to provide probabilistic proof of something. But if it turns out it's a bunch of bullshit, then there we are. So for example, Trump's repeated claims about election fraud, for example. Well, as we saw, just those lies seem to be sufficient to persuade a number of his supporters of the truth. But if you actually take some time to look at the evidence, there doesn't seem to be much substance, right? So you would say that it's weak as a probabilistic argument. You would say, well, given this evidence or lack thereof, I would conclude that it's probably not the case that the election was fraudulent or that it was stolen. So whenever you evaluate an argument, and so I already talked about this, there are sometimes implied premises. And so it's helpful to make those premises explicit because you can, in certain cases, be confused if a premise is hidden. So look at this example. We're almost out of time, but so condoms contravene or interfere in the natural process of procreation. Therefore, condoms are immoral. So this is an argument, right? Because there's a conclusion and there's at least one premise, but there seems to be a missing premise. So which premise is missing here?
A moral premise, right?
Yeah, and what would it be if you could kind of fill that in for us?
Saying that intervening with the process of procreation is wrong.
Good, yeah. Or yeah, interfering with or contravening in any natural process, whether procreation or otherwise, you might say, is wrong. And so that's the crucial hidden premise, which is, you rightly pointed out, a moral premise here. But this doesn't make it a bad argument just because that's missing or hidden, because you can pretty easily, as we just found, fill it in for us, right? But it's helpful to be cognizant of when there are missing premises and what those missing premises are, because sometimes unscrupulous arguers can deliberately hide premises in order to manipulate others. Okay, so moral statements. We already learned what a statement is. So it's not a question. It's not an imperative. So it's not a sentence that tells you to do something. It is a declarative sentence, as we know in grammar. So a moral statement would be one that uses the language of ought or should, for example, or some moral language. So moral language like wrong, or in this sentence, should, or ought, right? So in natural or physical science, for example, when we're dealing with a descriptive enterprise, scientists are just trying to tell you how things are, right? They're trying to describe the state of nature, or whatever it is that their domain of inquiry is. But when it comes to morality or ethics, we're not describing, we are prescribing. So we're not trying to tell you what is the case, but rather what we think should be the case or ought to be the case. And so that's the sense in which you'll encounter a moral statement. So it's something that tells you about what should or should not be the case, what is right or wrong, or what ought or ought not be the case. Okay. So this is an important point about is and ought statements, the relationship between moral and non-moral statements, but we're out of time here. Yeah, so I'll stop sharing the screen. So I made a few changes to those slides than is represented in the presentation that I have in the folder, the shared drive with the slides. So I'm gonna replace that one now. So I encourage you over the weekend or whatever to look through the slides. So I give you some examples in the remaining slides of informal fallacies. We didn't have time today to go over them, but I encourage you to look at those informal fallacies, those examples. And we can talk about some of them at the beginning of class on Wednesday. But again, there's no class on Monday for Martin Luther King Jr. holiday. So we won't see each other again until a week from today, next Wednesday, at which point we'll talk about chapter 5. So we'll get into moral theories and we'll talk about utilitarianism and egoism and so forth. And we might talk a little bit about chapter 4. So if you have questions about that, let me know. And also lastly, again, I just want to encourage you to vote for the final ethical issue that we're going to talk about if you have not already. I noticed that maybe 17 students haven't answered the poll. So do so right now if you can, because I hope to wrap that up by the end of this week before we see each other again next week. So there are no more questions or any comments. I hope you guys have a good weekend, but you can stick around if you want, if you have a question for me, but see ya.
Yeah.
Hey, Jackson, do you have a question or? No? Okay.